is probably a little bit older than you are. What very, very famous musician out of Key West, Florida, died 2 days ago? Jimmy, I'm among friends. He died of something we'll look at today, the particular cell, and down the road we'll look at, and I'll give you some insight into what it's all about. And that's coming up right away. He died of something that's relatively rare called a Merkel cell carcinoma, and and very, very rapid. His last concert is a guy I listened to in sports, is a Jimmy Buffett crazy. Seen him like 20 times in concert. His last concert was out in San Diego, May 6th, and he canceled for health, some kind of significant health. That was the last real time he did any performing, because he performed all over the place. And I was hardly what you would call a parrot in that regard, but I love Key West. Key West is great. Anybody been to Key West? See, when we went there, are you ready? Particularly Hannah in the back.
I'm ready.
Yeah. We found a place that was highly recommended on TripAdvisor called Angelina's Guest House. You know what it was in a previous incarnation in Key West? A house of ill repute. Not House of the Rising Sun, brothel, bordel. That, yeah, So that's where we end up not active anymore. But they changed. House of ill repute. We're going to have to educate you. Okay? So it was of that nature. And so we went there, but they used to, in the days when it was a property of Cuba, okay, they did a lot of cockfighting, which is horrible. And so when it became part of effectively a U.S. property and part of Florida, they gave all the chickens that were there amnesty, so they have the run of the island completely, and it's illegal to hurt them. So, and all you hear, they're just everywhere, and they wake you up very early in the morning, and we loved it. Some people wouldn't, but we loved it. It's great. Also, the best Garbo's Grill. It's on Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. We went to a couple of their places down there, and they have the best short rib taco, Korean style taco you have ever had. It's outrageous. Oh, so we went there twice. Good stuff. You're eating outside. It's gorgeous. It's Key West. Moving on. So much for the travel log for today. Today we're going to Erie for an anniversary. Go figure. So much for the travel log for today, and we'll do the skin. So to me, skin is fascinating. It's really, if you think of it surface area wise, it's immense. So it's effectively an organ system. So we consider, in the old days, it was the largest organ, I guess, by surface area. So even though we'll spend most of the day talking about particularly the epidermis today, and you may or may not have had some of this information before, it consists of not just the skin, as well as the epidermis and the dermis, of which there are 2 layers. Historically, the underlayer of fat, which was called the fatty or subcutaneous layer, is really no longer considered part of it. And so we used to think of 3 layers, with the sub-Q being part of the layer, but it's really not. Skin appendages we'll get to another time are hair and nails. Slightly different kind of keratin. The key word here is keratin, an insoluble structural protein that is found effectively only in these areas. Okay. Yes, the glandular structures, the sweat and sebaceous glands, are part of this as well. So here you have the epidermis in the outermost or superficial region. By definition, all, as you recall from what we talked about earlier, all epithelial lining tissues are avascular. They derive all of this, all of their nutrition, blood supply, get rid of their waste products other than out by way of the underlying tissue, which, although it's mostly a very dense fibrous connective tissue, there's a highly vascular part, which you'll hear consistently, is that underlying epidermal tissue. There's always loose areolar connective tissue. So you got 3 types of tissues here in a sandwich, and by definition, more than one type of tissue. Okay, 2 or more tissues is an organ, so that's why it's an organ. So sub-Q hypodermis, because it was below it. Really, in surgery, we call it superficial fascia. When you see, if you look at a video of someone making a surgical incision, I'm sure you find a ton of them. A good cut is right down to fascia. You make it deep enough that magically, like all the dermis and epidermis just go right apart. That's a beautiful cut, because in the fascia itself, in the superficial fascia, is where you find more significant blood vessels and nerves that you either have to cauterize or retract or identify and pull out of the field when you're doing it surgically. So the subcutaneous layer is technically underneath the skin, does share some of its functions. Certainly, there's a certain degree of shock absorption and insulation. There's a certain amount of anchoring that goes on, not a big deal. You'll see this illustration 1,000 times. Same one. Every textbook, every image, if you Google skin, you'll see this. And the most interesting thing, I think, is not that you can see that sweat glands and the little openings and hair follicles and the little openings are passageways in, and that's where infection from the skin creeps in. And I don't know whether in micro, because you mostly had 2390, right, with Dr. Maurer. I don't know how much he does on that stuff. I don't think he does a lot. What I try to do, if we have time for the last week, is we try to do some selective infectious disease topics, because I like that. And I have a ton of knowledge to share with you. I've treated a lot of infections, and I've made a lot of infections. We operate on people periodically. So moving on. The most interesting thing is not that they're the opening or how much activity there is below it. It's right here. Okay, so you can see it's not flat on flat. Okay, because imagine every time you were moving your epidermis against your dermis, if it's flat on flat, it would shift. It would be inherently unstable. And that what they call the dermal epidermal junction is when you get a blister, that's what happens. You're putting so much side to side tension or torsional factors that effectively you're damaging this system of pegs and holes. These are called reedy ridges, R-E-T-E, proper name, the capital, and these are called reedy pegs. Okay, and so that allows a certain degree of stability. So it doesn't shift around unless you're doing something that would overwhelm it, or it has something to do with foot gear, if it's on your feet, or activity that you're doing if it's with your hands. That kind of thing. And blisters are relatively common. It's not the only way we get blisters as well. Extreme swelling underneath will give you blisters. When we get to fractures, which we do in pretty short order because we're going to start bones pretty soon, you'll hear about fracture blisters, which are interesting. A deep fracture that's very severe with a lot of swelling will cause those layers to separate. So to me, that's it's a really significant feature because it's always about surface area. The more surface area, the more transition of waste products and nutrients, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. It's all about that. And the body is replete. It's just filled with areas where adaptations make up a lot of surface area rather than flat to flat. Think of how much more surface area is. And you have the nerves, and we'll get to the sweat glands and the sebaceous glands and explore the hair follicle. This is called a Pacinian corpuscle. It's like a deep sensor, mostly for vibrations, all sorts of things. Guys that are there. So the epidermis, by definition, is keratinized, meaning by forming that keratin in the outermost layer of this stratified squamous epithelia, it dies. And the keratin comes about and becomes a significant aspect of a barrier upon that. So as you will see, as it moves away from its blood supply, as we discussed a little bit in stratified tissue, it changes. In this case, the change is fatal because there's just not enough blood supply to take care of the 30 or 40 layers of lining cells that are piling up on top of each other, okay, that are there. So mostly keratinized, keyword, inside your mouth, the lining's non-keratinized. And there are 4 types of cells. 90% more or less keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are the cells that eventually form the barrier, form the keratin. So they produce that keratin, okay? It's the biggest cell there by number. It has lots and lots. It's strong, desmosome strength. We lose in tons. every day. When you shower, when you bathe. If you're like me and I spent a lot of time taking care of elderly folks, and maybe you have it with parents or grandparents or great grandparents, think of those days, particularly in the winter, when you try to get a pair of socks off, like dark socks, and you'll see like white powder. It's not talcum powder. Those are skin cells that are shedding. It's almost dandruff like, if you want to think. That's what it looks like. You see it all the time. Okay, the pigment cells, which depending on, and there's somewhat of a hereditary basis for this, are the melanocytes. They're stellate or spider shaped, lots of tentacle like projections. The compound they generate is melanin. That is the principal pigment. There's more than one kind of melanin. This one's relatively generic, and it basically, by way of those tentacle like projections, becomes released and absorbed in the other cells where they, and this is the big deal, protect the nucleus from ultraviolet light. Okay? I mean, that's the biggest problem with skin. I mean, what's going on out here today? Every year we have this, you're all familiar with it. They have, the clubs and everything out there. Look how many have tents out there today. Well, the biggest single problem we have to deal with our skin is exposure. And that brings us a little bit into the Jimmy Buffett saga, because effectively that skin cancer, which is rare and not necessarily clearly understood, plays a role with ultraviolet light exposure. Some of you, I suspect, like sun. I see it. Anna, I can see it. You're like my daughter.
I look tan outside.
You look. I'm going to get in trouble again. You can't compliment somebody today. You look great.
Thank you.
You all look great. When I was in school, students didn't look that good. They didn't. Bad looking. It was kind of stuffy. But first of all, I went to an all-boys school to start. What was I thinking?
Okay.
What was I doing there? It's crazy. Okay. This is class. I tell my students the same story all the time. I'll call my daughter. Okay. Hey, I can't talk, Dad. I'm tanning. First of all, do you take your phone into a tanning bed? Not that I'd ever been in one. And I keep telling her, oh, I have to get ready. It's bathing suit season. It's like, are you kidding me? Your skin is going to betray you. And I make the same point to her. And I think she's a little more careful. There's a lot of problems with this. And some sunblocks aren't necessarily your friend. You have to understand that as well. There are some materials in that are not necessarily kind. And so you need someone who knows what they're doing to tell you about it. And that's, we're the realm of dermatologists and people with skin and skin specialists like that. I know my daughter did a lot of it because for a while she was certified like an esthetician, with like laser treatments and stuff like that. But she doesn't do that. So their melanosomes transfer to the keratinocytes. Your defensive cells, another one of those cells, we talked about it in the superficial fascia. Okay, all of that lucerabular connective tissue, not superficial fascia, but the lucerabular connective tissue, superficial dermis, have all those white blood cells. You have these Langerhans cells are samplers. What they're doing immunologically is they're sampling the outside environment. Okay, your skin is completely covered in bacteria. Every square nanometer is covered in bacteria and viruses and fungi and things like that. And they're constantly sampling it, and it's like a tune-up for your immune system. So, and they've become, when they talk about key activators, when we get to immune system, which we do a little more thoroughly next term, because Dr. Maurer is not teaching immunology, which is an every other year type of thing. So I do a little bit more with it. So they're called antigen presenting cells. And here they are, the Merkel cells. In the skin, the tiny nerve endings that are sharp, dull, hot, cold, all that thing, all of that type of stuff, any kind of an irritant, any kind of significant sense, and you have many of them, sit on top of free nerve endings and respond. And this was the cell that was involved with regard to the damage. We think it's a virus that is very similar and used to be part of the family of HPV. That was the cause of this. Years ago, when I first learned about what we now call HPV or human papilloma virus, it originally was called papova virus, which stands for papilloma, polyoma, simian, because it was monkey, evacuating virus. Now we have papilloma, HPV, human papilloma, and then this is called a polyoma. Okay, polyoma virus. So it's a site, and it's relatively rare. Okay. So the epidermis has sublayers called strata. So, and strata just means layer. If you did the geology course or taken geology in the past, then you have strata, where different layers are there. So traditionally we teach 5. A great deal of the skin has only 4. The 5th layer is only, and I commented on it previously, as an optical illusion in thicker skin. And therefore it's called the stratum lucidum, because lucid means clear. And it doesn't stain. So that's why we think it's just a transition where it doesn't pick up the stain. So thick versus thin, hand, palm, soles, small of the back. The base layer, stratum basal, that is the generative layer. All the other cells coming from that layer. You will find all the other cells in and around that basal. So you'll have the standard keratinocytes, the melanocytes, the occasional Merkel cell, and the occasional Langerhans cell. And as you will see, as they begin to move farther away, and like I told you before, it's not like we're building one on top of each other. We have one, and the next one kind of forms underneath it. And then the next one underneath that. So it's getting, the original cell is getting pushed farther and farther away and transition. Again, the analogy of making like a brick wall and lifting up the bricks every time you put a new one in rather than putting them on top, which would be a significant degree of effort. So you will see as they begin to move farther away, we see them change. They appear, notice the choice of words, spiny, hence the name stratum spinosum. So they call it the spiny layer. And that's interesting in and of itself, where we begin to see those changes. So again, some folks think it's a process of what's going on with regard to absorbing the stain, but I don't have a plastic bag with me. Maybe I do. I usually carry a poop bag for the dog. I don't leave home without it. You never can tell. But what happens is when you have something like this that can, a cell, which is a dynamic structure, when it's attached with desmosomes at one end or the other, as you change it, it begins to change shape. So we think the spiny nature are where the desmosomes are, and as you tug on them, they create alterations in the shape that become visible microscopically. So there's a couple of theories behind it, not that terribly important. Where we see the first significant change that suggests that the cell is going to die is in the stratum granulosum. The granulosum has just a few layers, and its name comes from the fact that we see what are called keratohyalin granules. They are the precursor protein to keratin. Those keratohyalin granules, okay, you also see the nucleus beginning to change shape, suggesting that the cell's dying, and it's to some extent flattening out. Then again, in the thicker skin, we see this clear layer, and if not, then we see what's called a corneum, or hard layer, or horny layer, which is the cells have died and now they stack up. And the sum and substance leads frequently to maybe a total of 30 to 40 layers, maybe 20 to 30 of corneum, maybe 3 or 4 here, 3 or 4 here, and 1 here. Sometimes you get the better part of 40 or more layers of consistence of true epidermis. So here they are. The base layer, firmly attached to the dermis, single row, stem type cells, highly mitotic. It's roughly about, on average, for most of us, about 30 days. One of the problems with people who have psoriasis, the skin version of psoriasis, and there are others that we hear so much about, is typically that those cells are coming to the surface a little too quickly. So they're immature. And what happens, one of the signs is called auspitz, fancy name you don't have to know, capital AUSPITZ, is if you, like someone would pick at like one of these dry areas, people are prone to do, you'll see pinpoint bleeding. So that was one of the original diagnostic criteria, okay, for that type of a problem. So even though the cells die, for most of it's about 30 days. So it can vary within this realm. Okay, other daughter cells remain in the stratum basale as stem cells. The germinativum is another name for this. Okay, 10 to 25% melanocytes. So between 75 to 90 melanocytes, probably closer to 10. And it's funny, our coloration, our degree of pigmentation is less about how many there are, and it's more genetically about how active or inactive they are. So someone with albinism, someone who they don't make pigment at all, it's not because they don't have the melanocytes, it's there's a genetic interference in the pathway to generate the melanin. And you see it more in folks of color than you do in folks who are not of color. So it's very, very interesting in that regard. So the stratum, another name they give is the prickly layer, because the little points, web-like system of intermediate prekeratin filaments. I'll buy that. So you're starting to get some attachment to the desmosomes of these filament structures, and yes, they resist tension and pulling. Okay, and they sometimes call them prickle cells. Mostly say spiny cells. The prickly layer is not necessarily a common term, I think. Okay, and the abundant amount of melanosomes and dendritic cells, you'll see. And those are those Langerhans cells that have many tentacles like a typical white blood cell. The granulosome, 4 to 6 cells, flattening, appears thinner. Nuclei and organelles disintegrate. That's a sure sign of dying. Keratinization, you see the granules that are there. Okay, the cells accumulate other granules, and what happens is eventually you're creating a glycolipid that effectively creates that water barrier, the watertight barrier that effectively our skins have. Can we compromise it? Yeah, and you'll see different things that happen. Like if you're in the, yes, sir.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. I was gonna say, like, Dr. Badgett told me that skin isn't waterproof. Like when it wrinkles, it's absorbing water.
It is.
And I thought it wrinkles because of muscles.
I don't think so. I think there's a certain amount of absorption that occurs, and that I don't think, and there's not any muscle within the skin that's there. So to me, the wrinkling, and I'll look it up to see what the current theory, and I bet you most of them are theories, okay, is it macerates. When we talk about maceration, and most of us have gotten it. If you get, it's like some people are very prone to perspiration in between their fingers, toes, underarms. That's when you get irritation from that, particularly this kind of weather, hot, sticky days. You'll see that kind of wrinkling, not just in the skin, not like just you're in the pool forever, as people like to do. So I don't think it's muscles underneath. I personally do not. Is that was because muscle layers? There's really no muscle of any consequence other than the erector pili muscle, which is the muscle going to the hairs, and really it does make your hair stand on it, or goosebumps.
I heard it's like an evolutionary advantage. Have wrinkly skin underwater because you can have more grit.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. That's a short answer is I don't know. I'm trying to think of the right way to say it. I've never done any like diving of that type. I would, don't people who do scuba, don't they typically wear gloves or not? I don't know. Because my first wife was a scuba diver, certified. What? No, I can't say that I do. Sorry. I didn't mean to disappoint you. I'm sorry. Don't scuba. If it requires a great deal of athleticism or coordination, I try not to do it. Okay, mind over matter. I've always picked sports I love sport, but ones that are, that I participate in those that are less physical. Because I'm very slow. I have a vertical leap of about a half an inch, which is tough in basketball. And more important, moreover, any of this else, I am tremendously worried that everybody loves the Steelers as having a really good year. Whenever there's over, I hate it like that. I'd rather have it the other way around. Oh, you're not going to do anything. Yeah. But now it's like, oh my goodness. Oh, they won the preseason. Here's a clue about preseason games or exhibition games, or in the soccer world, what they call friendlies. They don't count. Very simple. They don't count. Though the one year the Steelers clearly won the preseason was 1974, when they had 6 preseason games and 14 regular season games, and that was the year of the first Super Bowl. And I got a heads up on that, so I didn't bet it. Short anecdote: the Steelers' head trainer during those heyday years of the 4 Super Bowls, Terry Bradshaw, Lynn Swann, that Chuck Noll era, the head trainer, a guy named Ralph Berlin, and my uncle were best friends, because my family's business supplied padding and strapping materials for sport teams, and they became best friends. So much so that they built retirement homes in Florida next to each other, that kind of best friends. So my uncle used to be on the sidelines during those games, and during those heyday years, and my aunt sat up with the Steeler wives. It's like, go figure. I never even got a shirt out of it. We made a lot of money out of it. So, which is funny because we're from Pittsburgh. I live in northern New Jersey. So cells accumulate keratohyalin granules that help form keratin fibers in the upper layers. If you go back and look at the Giants, then they were pretty bad. One year they won 1 game. That was, who's the guy whose grandfather, the Rams coach, Sean McVay, his grandfather, John McVay, was the Giants coach. I think they were like 1-15. That was 76. It was sad. Very sad. So keratinization begins, cells accumulate the granules, water loss. Okay, and now they've gotten away from the capillaries. The lucidum is a translucent band, but I don't buy that magically the cells that you could see now you can't see. I just think it's an inability to absorb the stain. And then the corneum, thickest of all the layers, and depending on the author, they might think that there's more. They've lost their nuclei, they're dead. That's the distinction when you can tell microscopically between lining cells in your mouth. That's why you can take the swab in there and get DNA, because the cells have nuclei and you can harvest the DNA. 3/4 of the thickness, protection, water loss, abrasion, multi-layered barrier. We'll talk about barriers in the immune system, but they're biological, they're physical by nature because they're strong. They're chemical because of perspiration, dermacidins, which are antimicrobial types of things. It's an acid mantle. As the plasma membranes begin to break down from bacteria, what's a membrane? A phospholipid bilayer. When lipids start to break down, and this is something biochemically, again, what do they break down into? They're short chain fatty acids. So hence the acidity aspect. That's there. And biological by nature, it's like I said, it's covered in microorganisms. So they undergo apoptosis, dandruff or dander, depending on. So here's their schematic. Here's the real thing as we begin to look at it. Okay. So you can see here one of those Merkel cells on top of a nerve ending. You can see a dendritic cell. You can see here the melanocytes, the ones in brown are all keratinocytes. And you begin to see an abundance of granules kind of coming up. And that's one of those pegs of dermal tissue. Here's a peg of dermal tissue. It's a little bit less distinct here. And here they're not showing you that transition zone, which would be typically at the end of, you can see the flattening out here. And you can see this is where they get the spiny or so-called prickly layer. And again, a lot of us think that has to do with how, look, when you take a piece of skin and you biopsy it has to go into a preservative. So, and I would take out a skin sample for biopsy with a lesion, with a mole or something on that there. I mean, you plop it right in formaldehyde. So it's going to have an impact on it. And then they look at it, it's not, doesn't come in the skin and magically get sectioned. Even in the operating room, we do a thing called a frozen section. They dip it into like dry ice, not to dry ice, into liquid nitrogen, and then slice it. So you can get a quick read on that, do frozen section. Decide whether you have to do something drastic or whether it's, not cancerous or doesn't appear to be invasive. The dermis, very strong, very flexible, okay? All sorts of white blood cells, all sorts of fibroblasts, everything that's in there. In the matrix, they're binding. So when you think about particularly the deeper portion of the dermis, that's what's used for making leather, those types of things, from what little I understand about the tanning process. Interestingly, in ancient Rome, they used to utilize, they'd collect the urine and use that as an agent to start that process. Just a little aside. So all the whole leather things that are like that. We used to sell a really good line of vegan purses. So because some people don't want to have, buy or support animal-based products, which I understand. It's killing me. I should know that. Sold a lot of them, and then they got very particular about it. You had to keep buying a lot from them to sell them. Sold them on Amazon, and we sold them in other places. They'll come to me. Not for a couple of years. Look, I like it. A nice crossbody bag, I like that. I've got this line of vegan purses. Began with a C. Oh, I hate that. It's. I'll know it in a second. Drives me nuts when I forget stuff like that. Chala. I didn't even have to. I all of a sudden it came to me. Chala. I see them, and then you can decorate them with like little accessory pieces. But they are. But they limited the way you could sell them. So let's say if we bought it for 50, you couldn't sell it for more than 100 to try to maintain the value. And then they became very restricted because they got very, very popular very, very quickly. I was raised in dry goods. And it's interesting because my wife, with all the work she did with goose clothes, is very fabric oriented. So she knows it better than I do. And why not? So moving on. So you can see that hair follicles, oil glands, sweat glands. So the two layers, the superficial is called papillary. And so the papilla are those ridges and pegs. And then so here they are. So here you have the dermal layer underlying. So here's the transition zone. Very famous, the dermal epidermal junction. It's like any other barrier. Like when we look at skin cancer, it's about how deep it goes. And we have a unit on that in this chapter. If it goes from here into here, it's more severe. If it gets down to here, it's more severe. If it gets into the fatty layer, it's extraordinarily severe. It's all about crossing these barrier type structures from one type of layer of tissue to another that are there. Different kinds of structures that are there. So here are the ridges and here are the pegs that are associated with it. So this is epidermis. This area, it's a little bit different. This is still epidermis here. And the ridges and pegs where the vascular supply is in this lighter shaded area. So interlacing collagen, elastic fibers, and stretchy. Enough room for the white blood cells to move around. So the projections contain, jumps up, capillary loops, free nerve endings, receptors, as another, and this is different than the Pacinian corpuscle, is the Meissner's corpuscle, which is more tactile in nature, fine tuning. I said Pacinian is a little bit deeper sensation. We call it deep touch and vibration that are there. So they lie on top, the dermal papilla lie on top of this dermal ridge. And because of its ridge structure, it develops ridges that are sometimes that are visible in the epidermis. We have a great name for these friction ridges, and these do work with gripping, even whether your hands are wrinkled or not. Sense of touch, sweat pores leave the unique fingerprint. So friction ridges are fingerprint. They're what basically causes fingerprints to occur. And you can see the tiny openings that are there, and they help to make it. And it's certainly of interest. Now, when we start to look at, and that's only about 20% of the dermis. The other 80% is made up of dense, fibrous connective tissue, irregular or coarse, not like tendons or ligaments, which are those parallel bundles. These are just in any direction. There's a lot of, again, tremendous amount of stretch and recoil that are there. They hold water inside. The good news, bad news, terrible blood supply. So they don't replenish themselves. If you have an injury, and we will go into the scarring process that occurs in the epidermis or the superficial dermis, it will heal without evidence. The minute you get into deep dermis, you're going to have scar. Whether how visible the scar is, that's a whole other matter. Okay? So, and then you have underlying that, between that and the fatty layer or hypodermis, a lot of blood vessels and nerve endings. So we get a different series of lines called tension lines in that area caused by collagen fibers, and some run parallel. We can't see them, but these are the lines that we use in surgery. So there's not a randomness necessarily to how to make a surgical incision. If you're going to have to put a new knee in somebody, it's about exposure. So you're not worried about those. You just go right. So here's the anterior knee, boom, straight line, open it wide up. But if you have the option of doing it, typically when you go over a joint, you want to you'll see that the fibers go differently. So, and how do you tell which way they run? You pinch. So you can pinch and see the lines. You can see the direction. So I pinch here, and I can see the lines coming. If I pinch it here, not necessarily as distinctive. So you can kind of see where they are. So if we're making, for instance, an abdominal incision, the reason we go straight down here is you're right over a piece of dense fascia that's underneath it that's relatively easy to sew together. So, but if you're doing like a hip surgery exposure, you kind of come at an angle. Or when you're doing a knee, you'll come across it. Okay. When you go over a joint surface, because it bends, those lines, you can see the wrinkling in your fingers where they come across like the joint surface. So they're really important, these so-called lines of relaxed skin tension that are there. So it's all about, if you're in those, if you go across them, they're more likely to have a distinctive scar than not. And even in plastic surgery, we'll change the direction of the scar. I can't draw it out. I used to be able to do that. Sounds improbable. But we do a thing, so a lot of times we would have effectively, you'd make, if this is something you're cutting, you'd make kind of a zigzag cut. Yeah, I can't do it these days. It's more like, I'm trying to think of a way, we call them a Z, I can't draw it. It's effectively, now in tendons, you lengthen them that way. So you have, let's say it's a piece of tendon, you'll make a cut that'll go across like this with a zigzag. And when you pull the pieces apart, then you can bring this end like that. And you can move this up or down, separate them, so you can effectively lengthen it. That's called the Z-plasty. And you can do the same thing with a scar and put the Z in the middle of the scar and change it. So and that's what plastic surgeons do. And they're really good at it. And I trained with a guy who was a great plastic surgeon. So flexure lines are different. Dermal folds near joints. So it's very secure to the joints. And so we see them particularly, and this is where you get somebody reading their palm. So if you thought the palm reading, there's a certain science behind it. So, I mean, someone's going to have more of those if they work a lot with their hands. Oh, you must work with your hands. How did you know that? See the lines. It's like, it's not magic. So, there's a lot of good old shows about that with two very, very talented musicians, Penn and Teller. And and if you've seen them, they've done a lot of those shows. I've seen them in Vegas a couple of times. And they show, what they do is they show you how their tricks work, a lot of them. It's kind of interesting to show you. So you'll have all this type of stuff, and then they'll pull it aside and show you the clear view about how they're doing all those things. So when we see this, when we see tears, stria, stretch marks, okay, blisters, like I said, the side to side pockets that will fill, stretch marks associated with weight, pregnancy, various things. The melanin, I'll give you these pigments and then we'll call it, okay, the only one that's made in the skin by melanocytes. It comes from we'll hear a lot about tyrosine over time. Tyrosine's a big player, chemically speaking. We get to adrenaline and noradrenaline, tyrosine. Okay, dopamine, tyrosine, big neurotransmitters. So the melanosomes shield the DNA. More sun, the more shielding you get. We have different colors that are there. Skin color differences are due to the amount and form. So it's more of a genetic basis than the number of cells. These are local accumulations, and most of us have them. It's unusual not to have them. You tend to get more of them as you get older that are there. So elastic fibers clump, and you get, like, we call it, the fancy term is lichenification, which means leathery, L-I-C-H-E-N, ification, ification. So the immune system alterations can do it, destroying folic acid, which you need for DNA. That's why we became very aware of folic acid supplementation, because we used to see a lot of neural tube defects, if you did not know that. Years ago, we had a thing called myelocele and myelomeninges, where infants were born where the spinal cord did not form and even outpouched. And it was really a tragedy. And those children were never going to be able to walk, and there was always going to be problems. Photosensitivity is a real thing. Okay, antibiotics, I've experienced with patients who had it. My mom got it from certain things. She couldn't tolerate the sun. So it's almost like you're allergic to the sun. You go out there and it's like, oh my God, I can't stand it. So, whenever we would go out, my mom would never come to us when we went to the beach or anything. She was just playing mahjong inside. Jewish ladies played mahjong. Okay, carotene, palms and soles. It's not that they only go there. It's a yellowish pigment, vitamin A. You'll see the relevance of vision, really important. It's not the fact that someone, let's say, of Asian descent, doesn't mean that they're high. It's more melanin based than carotene based. It's a combination. There's certain areas where it's more prevalent. Palms and soles. And lastly, hemoglobin. So because of in Caucasian races, more transparent, you can all see it. Just do this with your fingers. This is how we test for vascularity. How fast things pink up. Squeeze it, the nail's white, and boom, almost instantaneously it pinks up. Do it with here, same deal. You have someone with vascular disease, we see how quick the filling time is. It should be almost instantaneous. Elevate a foot in a diabetic patient, squeeze. Sometimes you're waiting for a while. That's never a good sign. So those three add up to it. And we'll stop it here, and I'll start with these guys. So I'll remember to start this when I give you some of the information. And then we'll meet again on Monday. Thank you. Nice seeing you. Maybe not.